I was recently speaking with an older friend who was recalling going to Boy Scout camp or something like that when he was young. The story that kept them awake in their cabins was that there was a man in the woods. Occasionally, people would hear noises outside the cabin, scratching at the windows or branches snapping in the wood. Some folks attested to coming across the smoldering remnants of recent campfires in the woods nearby where the same scouts swore they saw lights or, in some telling, phantom lights. The campfire, unsettling as it meant an uninvited and equally unseen guest, is the tableau of the phantom hobo, this wild man of the mountain forest whose intentions cannot be trusted. It doesn't seem that scary on its face to come across an abandoned campfire, but at night, when you're not expecting a campfire, maybe. Sure, I wondered what the other side of the story was before I realized that I'd been that person before. There was the night when we were the phantom hobos. Our small town, there were less than 1,000 of us living among the old brick structures of a Teutonic cult which had come over from Württemberg at the dawn of the 19th century. Our town buttresses another slightly larger town, less than 4,000 people. The end of my street was actually the border between the two towns, and all of it sat and still sits in a valley north of Pittsburgh. There wasn't much to do. There was a rope swing, which was a 4-mile bike ride through town behind some industrial buildings and along narrow paths between stinging nettle. Then you would come to a large sycamore hanging over a notoriously polluted creek. Somebody braver than I had shimmied up the wide trunk and secured a good length of rope to the first good branch. The best times to go to the rope swing, in my opinion, was during a drought when the water was only 3 feet or so. You'd swing out a third of the way across the creek, hopefully land near the pebbly center because the ground was all muddy and thick near the shore. Once, I thought I'd bettered the mud by swimming with an old pair of Chuck Taylors on. My thinking was that the rubber soles, the canvas being mostly a memory, were essentially water shoes, which no sane person would waste their money on buying water shoes, and here I had them. When I landed in the water, though, deeper and swifter now due to the recent rains, my feet swung up in front of me and I was fighting to keep them down. My friend Brandon, realizing I was being carried down the creek, swam out and grabbed my arm and helped me get back to shore. The rope swing was the place of adolescence that supplanted the pond in Brandon and my backyard where we used to catch frogs. The rope swing was better, not only since there weren't any frogs left at the pond, Brandon having caught a huge dinosaur of a turtle, carrying it several miles before releasing it into a pond where it proceeded to eat everything but the carp. But the rope swing was better because adult things happened there. There was a skinny old stoner guy who insisted his name was Michael Jackson, which was definitely not true. What was true was that he definitely lived in an old camper impossibly in the woods near the rope swing. I should have been more worried about this at the time, but I was 13 or so and risky decisions were du jour, and what's more, sometimes older girls would swing out topless. Our times at the rope swing or jumping off the railroad trestle would probably be frowned upon by most of the adults in town. They didn't even like it when we skateboarded in the barren old tennis court which they called a skate park. There honestly weren't many options. The town had 6 antique stores, 8 bars, 9 churches, 16 restaurants, and 2 bowling alleys. Growing up, we marked our time between buying antique books and pens and eating at the older diners, petty vandalism, and reading magazines with the old man who ran the newsstand. Aside from school, the only rigid seasonal obligations were football for Art and Brandon and ice hockey for myself. We did have 2 bowling alleys. I mentioned that earlier, I believe. The one along the highway had all-night bowling on Friday and Saturday nights, where for something like $10, I think, you could bowl from 10 at night until 2 in the morning when the bar inside the bowling alley closed. Like everything, going to the bowling alley meant riding your bike or walking, and walking normally meant a circuitous route through old alleys where outhouses once stood to vague forest paths. The most direct route from our neighborhood to the bowling alley meant walking through the park, taking a trail through the woods which opened up to the cemetery. From there, you could walk along the road that ran up against a long rectangle of land which hosted a cornfield and a baseball diamond. Across from these was the back of the bowling alley. Looking at Google Maps, this walk is just shy of 2 miles, though you can trim nearly a quarter off by another route. But the town had an 11 o'clock curfew, so that route, which meant walking up the plain road, was barred for us, at least on our way back home. So the woods, the gravestones, and the corn stalks were preferable for the walk home. We would leave the bowling alley thumb sore from flinging the heaviest balls we could and always working on that spin, and walk behind the alley through the cornfield, on the lookout for headlights at all times. Brandon and I had actually been picked up by the police once. Thankfully, we were only a few blocks from my house, and feigning ignorance of a curfew, the officer just drove us home. Once, we had to drop to the ground when walking out of the woods and into the park. A spotlight fanned over our heads from the police cruiser on the street, which was only a baseball field separating us. There were a lot of baseball fields in our town, and I forgot to include them in the original census. I believe there were 8 baseball fields. On another occasion, we ducked through backyards, Brandon, Art, and I, and between houses as 2 cruisers zigzagged through the streets looking for us. Through it all, we didn't get back home until nearly 4 in the morning. There wasn't a lot for kids to do in our town, and I suspect there wasn't a lot for the police to do either. There were only 2 murders through the whole of my time in town, and there remains 1 unsolved kidnapping, but that had occurred a few years before my family moved to Pennsylvania. I imagine chasing us around was as exhilarating for the police as it was for us, and it was a way to punctuate the evening when all the bars closed. The town was mostly asleep. Even the stoplights in town shut down shop between 2 and 4:30 in the morning. There were only 3 of them anyhow. We'd get back to my house, because my house was often empty, and crash on couches for a few hours before getting up and walking the 7 blocks downtown like free men and to the country kitchen, after which we'd sleep or skateboard until it was hot enough to go to the rope swing. And for years, that was what our summers were like. I remember enjoying it at the time, and I still look back on that period of my life fondly. I'd only wish I had more money back then. Then Art had a plan. We called it the November Plan. Why should we waste the time and energy walking all the way back to my house after curfew with all the risk and accelerated heart rates that it involved? What if we just had a campfire and sit out in the woods until the curfew lifts, and then we can walk down Main Street to the country kitchen? It was such a wonderfully simple idea, made all the more simple by the fact that Art already had figured out a place where we could have a fire. He had found some burn barrels while walking through the woods one afternoon near the bowling alley. The site required us to only cross 1 street. From the cornfield, we'd run across the street into a field of tall grasses, and from there, the woods. We were only in the open while we were in the cornfield and crossing the street, because the stalks of which had been laying flat since harvest. There, we kill some time and then just leave at either 5 or 6 in the morning. I can't remember when curfew lifted. No 2 miles of snooping around, crossing through town. Just 1 cornfield, 1 rural street. It was so obvious. We ought to have thought of it a long time before. We all agreed that Art's greatest moment was the November Plan. And why did we call it the November Plan? Because the idea was so good it needed a name. Plus, the next Friday would be taking us into the month of November. We left the bowling alley at close. Brandon had a book bag with food, I think marshmallows, maybe hot dogs, which seems a bit silly since we were just killing a few hours before breakfast. But we ate a lot more back then. It must have been hot dogs because I remembered him having ketchup too. We'd also hidden 2 gallons of iced tea behind the bowling alley, which we retrieved before hopping the fence into the cornfield. Art brought us to the site. It was as he described, a small clearing about the size of a bathroom. There was a fallen tree which we sat on. A few yards away was a burn barrel which we picked up and moved in front of the downed tree. I should pause here. Honestly, I don't know how many people know what a burn barrel is. I remember everyone having them when I grew up, but this may be another one of those things that I assume everyone knows about, only to discover somewhat awkwardly that these are not part of the normal experience. The short of it is, burn barrels are big metal drums, like oil drums. I believe you would get them from the borough office. They were placed in the backyard, and people would burn a good bit of the trash. Even restaurants did this. When I worked for the Italian restaurant on Main Street, I was often in the back burning boxes. The wax cardboard that eggplants arrive in seemed to go up faster, as though they were coated with an accelerant. I think the burn barrel thing started to phase out as more recycling methods were introduced, and I don't see them around that much anymore. They also always came rusty. I've never seen one that wasn't rust. Anyhow, we'd eaten, and Art had fallen asleep on the ground. Brandon built the fire up to the point where tongues of flame briefly threatened to touch the lower branches of the pines. It was a little after 3 in the morning when we thought we heard a door. We hadn't been particularly loud, but Brandon and I quieted down just the same. After a few minutes of continued silence, we assumed we'd heard something in the woods, a deer, just spooked ourselves. It was almost 10 minutes later when Brandon and I definitely heard a car door shut hard. Without speaking, I took what was left of one of the teas and doused the fire. The fire was out, but the smoke became thicker, but lighter in color somehow. While I was doing that, Brandon was waking Art up. We stood there for a minute when we heard another door, unmistakable considering how alert we now were. We began moving towards the high grasses which would lead us back out to the road. Once we were out in the grasses, one of us, I think Brandon, had us look back where, less than a football field away, inside the tree line, 2, possibly 3 flashlights were scanning around. We bolted. We ran hard to the road and down the distance of a couple blocks to where we holed up behind a greenhouse to catch our breaths and take stock of what happened. When we started hearing the doors, I began to think that we must be closer to a house than we'd been aware. I had thought at the time that maybe people had just been getting home, and certainly nobody suspected we were sitting in the woods, but the burn barrel must have belonged to somebody, right? But at the same time, a burn barrel in the middle of the woods wouldn't necessarily be out of place. We found all sorts of stuff in the woods, including the remnants of an old house. It was the flashlights that really freaked us out. Were they from the homeowners? Was it police? The flashlight beams did seem powerful, like those long, heavy black metal ones we'd seen in the hands of the police and of guys in the neighborhood who did not purchase flashlights as an afterthought. We hadn't been running. We hadn't really been aware that other people were in the woods until we saw those flashlights. Being prudent, we continued onward, assuming that the lights were from the police, likely 2 officers. As such, we moved between houses and into the cemetery, staying along the tree line of the forest, which would take us to Art's house. We made it there without event. I remember sitting in Art's room for an hour or so before the curfew lifted. The whole house stunk like a campfire, which I attributed to the strangely thick smoke from when I doused the fire with the tea. Our first attempt at the November plan was a bust. In the afternoon, we walked down the road that separated the cornfield and the tall grasses that led to the wood and the burn barrel. Continuing along the road past where we normally would, we noticed a narrow gravel driveway, and through the thinning autumn trees, we could see a house. It looks like we were essentially camping out in somebody's backyard. It was only because of the topography that we were not able to see the lights of the house or realize just how close we were to them. I thought about this as I listened to the old camp story about the phantom hobo, the wild man of the mountain forest whose intentions couldn't be trusted. I thought about the homeowners who thought they heard noises in the wood just up the hill from their back door, and what they and or the police must have thought when they came upon an abandoned campfire in the middle of the night. What must they have thought? It seems like an old-timey situation not experienced since the end of World War II, when the number of roaming vagabonds seems to have died off or become tired and made a home somewhere. We were definitely somebody's phantom hobos. We would attempt the November plan one more time. The obvious issue was that we needed a new location. The less obvious concern was that it needed to be suitable for a fire. It's only as I say this now that I realize how unnecessary that is, and how a large part of the appeal for us was finding an excuse for a fire. Certainly we could have just sat in the tall grasses across the street from the cornfield for a few hours, or down the road and sit behind one of the billboards on the hill before the highway dropped into town. Heck, we could probably have just sat in those folks' backyard if we didn't have the fire. I know that this wouldn't do, though. We needed to have a fire. There's a thick forest of maples and hemlocks behind the elementary school. Paths we and other neighborhood kids had forged for years. These woods, called the school woods, sat on a large hillside immediately behind the school. Down below and across more fields were two long streets of houses and a factory. These made up the tail end of the town. It was all about half a mile from Art's and my house, which meant that we still had to endure nearly the whole of our cross-town trek. But the thought of being in the woods with a campfire and prolonging our violation of curfew in the face of our over-eager police was just too appealing. Art had made a fire pit the day before, and we found ourselves there in the wee hours of the morning making hot dogs over the fire and always drinking iced tea. Below, through the bare trees, you could see the lights of the houses on Spruce Street and occasionally a passing semi along the major highway which buttressed against our town and connected Erie to Charleston, West Virginia. It seemed like a much more secure location. We knew where all the houses were in this part of town. We were halfway down the hill, out of sight from our part of town on the bluff, blocked by the school and by being downhill, and we were certainly too far for the back windows and doors of Spruce Street so far below. Last weekend's attempt, though, clearly suffered from a lack of reconnaissance and adequate strategic planning. Brandon breathed the fire high, confidently. But again, around 3:30, we heard the sirens, and they were definitely moving towards us. More tea on the fire. Art, not having fallen asleep, grabbed our meager gear up with Brandon and began to run through the moonlit woods towards the back of the school behind the water tower, where a trail broke off to a steep rocky path that would lead to Art's house. We paused only so long that I could throw up a bit of hot dog, my stomach cramping from trying to keep up. I was always the slowest runner, being instinctively drawn towards ice hockey and not football like Art and Brandon. My running form was all hell and resembled some sort of bow-legged glide. We were at Art's house in a few moments. The sirens had died off, but we thought we could hear trucks nearby. Brandon and I left Art at his house and walked down the side of the road that led from his house to the elementary school whose woods we'd just run through. Hidden by the building and the trees, we could see the lights of the emergency vehicles. Somebody down on Spruce Street, we surmised, must have thought the woods were on fire. We never tried the November plan again, though I still think it's a good idea. Were I 14 again, I'd recommend we locate another spot, or, knowing that we'd never do it without the fire, insist that we keep the fire low. Regardless, we avoided being caught and left a bit of mystery behind. Because we weren't caught, I remember those nights as fun. And they were this sort of Tom Sawyer experience which I was always seeking out as a kid. I wonder what the other side of our story sounds like, though. I've been thinking about the November plan a lot since hearing of the Phantom Hobo, and wondering how the other side of the Boy Scout camp story read.